In 1968, Pope Paul VI released Humanae Vitae, an encyclical affirming the Church's constant teaching regarding contraception. Sadly, Humanae Vitae came as a shock to many Christians both inside and outside the Catholic Church, who thought the Church was ready to accommodate herself to the modern view of marriage as primarily a relational and not a procreative institution. Indeed, in the wake of Humanae Vitae, the Catholic Church largely lost her ability to successfully convince the American laity, not to mention Christians throughout the West, of the truth and beauty of her moral teaching on matters related to sex and marriage. A number of historical, sociological, and ecclesiological factors account for this failure. Let me just mention one for today's purposes. Soon after its release, Humanae Vitae suffered immeasurable harm from clerical and lay intellectuals who attacked the teaching as hopelessly out of touch, hopelessly inflexible, and hopelessly bereft of compassion on matters related to sex and marriage. The pronouncements of Charles Curran, Andrew Greeley, Richard McBride, and other like-minded Catholic theologians and social scientists added immeasurably to the confusion, dissent, and scandal that swirled around Catholic social teaching and sexual teaching. Now, in various ways, with varying degrees of clarity and honesty, the dissenters argued that the Church must accommodate her morality to the ways of the world if she hoped to speak in an authentic way to the experience and concerns of modern men and women. They also argued, and this is important, that the most compassionate route forward for the Church was one that led to changes in her moral teaching. Law must give way to grace, rules must give way to experience, dogma must give way to the Spirit, and the Pope must give way to the people. Now, in the heady decade of the 1970s, when a countercultural tide swept over the Catholic Church and the nation as a whole, as the slide on the left indicates, and the Academy was in the thrall to the counterculture, this accommodationist agenda seemed to have a certain plausibility, but no longer. The first problem with this agenda is that it's based on bad social science. When most of these intellectuals were in their prime, back in the 70s and 60s, the best social science suggested that the ideal posture of the Church to family change, as it's euphemistically called, was one of acceptance and support. But contemporary social science on the contentious issues of our time, such as contraception, divorce, and cohabitation, suggests just the opposite conclusion. The shifts in sexual and familial behavior to which these dissenters would like the Church to accommodate herself have been revealed in study after study to be social catastrophes. Now, let me be perfectly clear here. The leading scholars who have tackled these topics are not Christians, and most of them are not political or social conservatives. They are rather honest social scientists willing to follow the data wherever it may lead. And the data has, as we shall see, largely vindicated Christian moral teaching on sex and marriage. So the intellectual foundations for dissent on moral matters have collapsed. The second problem with the dissenting agenda is that its moral laxity has been disastrous for the most vulnerable members of our society, for the poor. The poor have paid and continue to pay the largest price for the cultural revolution that Curran, Greeley, McBride, and others would like the Church to baptize. And actually, I drove in this morning through North Philadelphia, and you really don't need to go anywhere but North Philadelphia to kind of see this, unfortunately, in practice. So let me now turn to a discussion of the social science on these issues. And the reason I have this picture here is to kind of illustrate the problem with the accommodationism. That we have Woodstock here on the left, this celebration of, what does it say? Music, peace, and love, I think, here. And then we have here a book called Promises I Can Keep, about actually women in the Philadelphia area, white, black, and Latino women, Puerto Rican women, who are having kids without marriage, outside of marriage, and who typically end up in a matter of a few months or a year or two as single mothers. And the point I'm trying to make here is that this sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s has now given us a culture where we have more and more women raising kids without a husband and father. Just to give you a few figures to illustrate the retreat from marriage in the U.S. From 1960 to 2000, we saw illegitimacy rise from 5% to 33%. It's now at 35% in our country. Divorce rose from 20 to 45%. Actually, there's some good news on that, which I'll get to at the end. But the bottom line here is a dramatic increase in divorce in this period. As a consequence of these changes, kids are much more likely to live outside of an intact married family. Back in 1960, 80% of kids would spend their entire childhood with both their mother and their father. Today, only about half of all kids will spend their entire childhood with their mom and their dad in the home. Now, how do we understand these changes? What's behind these changes? And my mentor at Princeton, Sarah McClanahan, gave an address recently which kind of outlined what we know about family change in America. And she hit on four main themes in her talk. And I'm going to hit these briefly and focus the rest of the discussion on the last theme. And Sarah is a moderate, agnostic, formerly divorced, now remarried woman. She's not a conservative. She hits, first point, is declining real wages of men. And this is particularly true for poor working class and minority men who have seen their real wages decline in the last 40 years. This makes them less attractive as marriage partners. It also has an effect on their sense of masculinity, their sense that they can be good husbands and good providers. So that's one reason we've seen the kinds of trends that I've talked about in the previous slide. Another issue is means-tested public policies. Most of our public policies serving the poor have basically an income threshold. If you go above that threshold, you no longer get the benefit. Now, if you're a working class or poor couple and you guys get married and you have kids, the reality is that you stand a strong likelihood of losing access to your tax credit or Medicaid or some other public benefit because you have gotten married and now you would report your income, your combined income, to the government. By contrast, if you cohabit or live apart, you can continue to get benefits. So in terms of practically, many poor working class couples would face a hit of their real income of about 1/3 were they to marry. So that's another reason that we've seen these trends. The third thing that she mentions is feminism, the changes in the lives of women. I'm going to touch on this in a second in greater detail, but you can imagine some of the things that have played out with regards to feminism and women's roles and the retreat from marriage in our country. The final point that Sarah McClanahan made was that contraception, abortion, and the larger sexual revolution played a key role in undercutting marriage. And that in turn has had a disproportionate consequence on the family lives of minorities and the poor. So what's the story here sociologically? Well, when we look at divorce, the work of Robert Michael, who's an economist at the University of Chicago, is illustrative. And he asks of the data, why did our country see the divorce rate basically double between 1960 and 1980? And he attributes about half of this trend to the consequences of the contraceptive revolution. And what's going on here? Well, this picks up on Rick's talk just a few minutes ago. One point to make here is that married women could focus more on education and careers. As a consequence, of course, those things are not in themselves badly, but one of the consequences of that shift in focus was that they became less dependent financially and practically on their husbands, and they were also more likely to see more egalitarian marriages from their husbands. And oftentimes husbands didn't make changes with sufficient speed, and as a consequence, women would leave their marriages. In fact, it's still the case that about 2/3 of all divorces in the US are initiated by women. It's kind of goes against the model of the midlife crisis for the guy where he divorces his wife, gets the red sports car. But in reality, most divorces are initiated by women. I think a big part of this is the issue of equality and also the issue of kind of his emotional engagement in the marriage. Another outworking of contraception, though, and this was one that affected both spouses, both the husband and the wife, was the way in which contraception allowed couples to move their focus away from having kids and raising a family and more towards fulfilling their own desires, their own needs for financial and emotional satisfaction, at least thinking that they could do that by buying a bigger house, putting off kids, continuing that vacation to Florida or wherever else, and not kind of focusing sort of outside themselves, on the tasks of bearing and rearing kids in the context of a healthy family life. I think also a consequence was that they were more likely to set higher expectations of what marriage might hold out to them, emotionally. Expectations which were not easily met. And when they were not met, folks were more likely to resort to divorce. So these are some of the kinds of explanations that folks like Robert Michael have offered to us to explain this association between contraception, the pill, and divorce. Now, when you think about the whole issue of non-marital childbearing or illegitimacy, I think of the work of George Akerlof, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist at Berkeley. His wife served on President Bill Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. Once again, he is not a conservative. But he asks of the data this question. And that is, why did non-marital childbearing surge after the introduction of the pill and abortion? These are just some of the figures in this time frame. And he poses this question, making the observation that at the time, in the 1960s, most academics, most public health experts, most policy leaders assumed that if you gave women the means to control their fertility one way or another, that you would see, naturally, a decline in illegitimacy, right? But that's not what happened. That's not what happened. So what was it about the pill and then abortion that pushed us in the opposite direction than the experts thought we would move? Well, he argues that contraception and abortion constituted a, quote, technology shock to the relationship market. Now, bear in mind, he's an economist talking about relationships. So it's all about, markets of this and that. And who's rich and who's poor and this sort of stuff. He argues that contraception and abortion eviscerated or impoverished more traditional minded women. So in other words, if you were in the 1960s and you're a woman who kind of had in mind a strong connection to getting married, having kids, doing the whole family thing, in his view, you were eviscerated or impoverished by the introduction of contraception and abortion and the larger sexual revolution. By contrast, he argues, if you're a more hedonistic-minded woman in this period of time, and you weren't particularly interested in having kids, at least at that point in your life, and you were interested in having a little fun on the side with your boyfriend, these developments gave you the tools to do that without the consequences, without having to worry about having a baby. And so he argues that as a consequence, there are more women available to men at this period of time who are willing to give themselves away sexually. And so that put a lot of pressure, especially on kind of women in the middle, who might not have had sort of a clear commitment to norms about chastity, who might have been sort of pulled in different directions in terms of their desires for family and the desire for maybe fun with their boyfriend or just wanting to please him. And so what Akerlof argues is that the more hedonistic-minded women and the women kind of in the middle were much more likely to have sex, and that even the more traditional-minded women had more pressure from their boyfriends to have sex. And so as a consequence, there was a lot more sex happening in this period of time, and especially for the moderate women, the women in the middle, and for some of the more traditional women, they ended up getting pregnant. But because of the introduction of contraception and abortion, men felt like they had greater freedom now to just walk away from a pregnant girlfriend. In other words, it was her choice, it was her decision to have this child, and they were no longer responsible for the consequences of their own actions here. And so as a consequence, you had a dynamic where more and more people were having sex outside of marriage, pregnancies were happening, and yet more and more men felt like they were free to walk away from a pregnant girlfriend. His larger point then is that in this period, among other things, the norm of premarital sexual abstinence all but vanished in the wake of the technology shock. In other words, once people could have what they thought was, in a sense, pregnancy-free sex, it reduced one of the kind of the natural incentives that would support traditional morality. And as a consequence, there were just dramatic changes in sexual behavior and then in out-of-wedlock childbearing. Now, another point that he makes in his article, and I'll touch on this a little more in more detail in successive slides, is that this increase in non-marital childbearing was in turn linked to the feminization of poverty. That is, to more and more young women, single mothers, living in poverty. And his kind of concluding comment about this particular phenomenon is this. It's a pretty powerful one, I think. And that's that just at the time, about 1970, that the permanent cure to poverty seemed to be on the horizon. And just at the time that women had obtained the tools to control the number and timing of their children, single motherhood and the feminization of poverty began their long and steady rise. So in other words, the opposite of what the experts anticipated from the pill and abortion is what happened. An increase in single motherhood and increase in the feminization of poverty. Because norms against premarital sex have been obliterated by all this. Now, in another article, he looks at how all this affected young men, especially working class and poor men. He notes that there was a decline in marriage among young men, and this actually just gives you kind of a picture of this, because among younger guys, say in their ages 20 to 25, this trend would be even more dramatic. The bottom line, though, is that more and more young men, especially poor working class men, were not getting married in their early 20s and even in their mid-20s. And they were not getting domesticated or civilized by marriage and their wives, okay? And all of us probably know how men change often after they get married, and for the most part, good ways. He points, though, to increases in 1970s in substance abuse and crime. And I would also add probably tomcatting in this period too. And how they were all kind of linked to the fact that these young men who would have normally gotten married and had kids and sort of settled down were not doing that. Rather, they were hanging out with their buddies and getting in trouble in one way or another. So the marriage, for instance, is one of those things that tends to encourage guys with troubled adolescent backgrounds to shift away from that and to become more responsible, more law-abiding. So a lot of the crime that we saw in places like North Philadelphia increased dramatically in the 1970s can be attributed to the decline in marriage, which was in turn linked to the sexual revolution. Now, one point that I want to make today here is that social conservatives, I think, often don't always appreciate the degree to which the things that they're worried about and concerned about have had a disproportionate effect on the poor and the working class and on minorities in America. And these figures just kind of illustrate how the retreat from marriage has fallen disproportionately on the backs of racial minorities and on less educated Americans. We see dramatic differences by race in illegitimacy here, and also we see dramatic differences by college education in illegitimacy. So it's not the case that this thing has kind of affected people in the country in the same way. There's pockets of America that have had a disproportionate or taken a disproportionate hit from this. And one question is, why is it that the retreat from marriage has been disproportionately harmful for working class and poor folks and for African Americans? And I would just say two things quickly on this point. If you think about marriage as sort of supported by two pillars, kind of moral, religious pillar on the one hand, and a kind of socioeconomic pillar on the other hand, where people are invested in their marriages for a range of reasons. Some can be a commitment to their faith, some notion of what's moral and good. There are also kind of, let's be honest, there are real practical things that orient people towards their marriages. Maybe a shared mortgage. A sense that, my kids will do a lot better if we stay together and we can afford college more readily. And the argument here is that middle-class Americans, I think both kind of consciously and unconsciously sense there's some kind of economic advantage and social advantage, both for them and for their kids, to getting married and staying married. And so even though many of the moral and religious pillars have kind of weakened in their lives, they still have some sense, this is really the best thing for me and my kids. And so that helps us to understand why it is that they actually have done better on things like illegitimacy and divorce. Whereas for a poor and working class couple who don't own a home together and don't see themselves as being able to own a home together, they don't have that socioeconomic kind of orientation towards the benefits of marriage. And they've lost also now the religious and cultural supports for marriage. So as a consequence, I think they've been much more likely to fall prey to this retreat from marriage. African Americans, I would just say basically it boils down, and this is somewhat simplified, as slavery, one word, slavery. I don't think we fully understand the ways in which slavery undercut the black family. The fact that a man could not be with his mate, oftentimes for life. The fact that a woman might have children with a variety of different men because men were coming in and out of a plantation. A man could not provide for his family under slavery. A man might see his partner, his wife, even though they weren't officially married, taken advantage of or raped by a slave owner. So if we can kind of think about how those things affected the relations between men and women, we can imagine all the kind of downsides. And there's a tradition, it's called the love and trouble tradition in the black community that really extends, I think, back to slavery and has continued to some degree in our country since slavery. Now, of course, back in the 1920s, there were much higher levels of family stability among African Americans than there are currently. But it was still the case that relative to whites, blacks did have higher levels of single motherhood, higher levels of infidelity, and higher levels of divorce and separation. And so my argument would be that this underlying vulnerability was accentuated by the consequences of the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. It helps us to understand why these changes have been so much more consequential for African Americans. Now, why should we care about the retreat from marriage, the erosion of marriage, sociologically? And I helped to write a report called Why Marriage Matters with 15 other family scholars that kind of details some of the reasons why we should be concerned about these trends. Let me mention, first of all, the issue of poverty. After divorce, between 1/5 and 1/3 of mothers will fall into poverty. I mean, it's obvious. You're splitting up a household. Oftentimes, the ex-husband's income does not go in any large degree to his ex-wife, and so many of these women end up falling into poverty. Another point is that even for women who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, they're much more likely to have lower incomes if they don't get and stay married than similar women who manage to get and stay married. So it's not just a question of kind of underlying pre-existing economic differences being the real story here. It's that women who come from poor environments and poor neighborhoods who manage to get and stay married actually do a lot better over time economically than their peers who don't manage to get married and stay married. Think about these trends in the aggregate. What we know is that virtually all of the increase in child poverty in this country since the 1970s can be laid at the feet of the retreat from marriage. This comes from work done by Isabel Sahel at the Brookings Institution. Once again, she's not a social conservative. She's just an honest economist. What about boys and delinquency and crime in prison? The point here is that there's something about growing up with your father in the home. It's very important for boys and adolescents. There's something about seeing a man whom you love and admire handle difficulty, frustration, in a way that's responsible. There's something about seeing him earn a decent living, day in and day out, that establishes a kind of template for young men that's obviously constructive. And boys who don't have that template often will resort to what's called a kind of hypermasculinity, where they try to prove themselves as young men by being violent, by engaging in criminal activity, and by getting their girlfriends pregnant. But just in terms of the crime, what we know from the evidence is that boys who are raised in single and step families, so it's not just being raised in a single mother household, it's boys who are raised in step families, that is with a stepfather, are more than twice as likely to end up in prison as young adults, as in their early 30s, compared to boys who are raised with their mother and their father. We know that boys who come from fatherless households are much more likely to end up in state reform schools, to be adolescent murderers, and to be rapists. Or they haven't had the experience of healthy masculinity modeled directly in their home. And this is what happens when they don't have that. We also know from work done by Robert Sampson at Harvard, a sociologist, that one of the strongest predictors of murder and violent robberies is the percentage of single mothers in an urban neighborhood. So once again, when dads are not in the home, when dads are not in the community, the whole neighborhood, the whole community pays a heavy price for that reality, as indicated by that finding. It's not just boys that benefit from having a dad in the home. It's also girls who benefit from having a father in the home. Once again, it comes back in part to this whole issue of a template. Seeing a man in the home, your father treating your mother with respect and dignity and affection and love, is very important for giving a young woman a sense of what she is going to aspire to when she starts to meet adolescents, when she starts to meet young men. If she doesn't have that model in the home, she's much more likely to give way to the entreaties of a teenager or a young man who's trying to get his way with her. It's also the case, of course, too, that when fathers directly treat their own daughters with affection, with a sense of concern, they set limits for their daughter's behavior. Daughters going to know that there is a man in their life, their father, who really is invested in them. And they're not tempted to prematurely go seek the affections of a man who is not their father and who doesn't have their best interest in mind and wants to take advantage of them in some way. So these kinds of ideas explain why we get stats like this. This is from a study done by Bruce Ellis, looking at young women in New Zealand and in the United States. Similar trends both in New Zealand and in the US, so it's not just a US phenomenon, not that I would be expecting that it would be, but the point is that women, I should say teenage girls, whose dads leave before age 6 are much more likely to become pregnant than girls whose dads are there throughout their entire childhood. And one thing you probably didn't know, the effect of fathers actually extends to the biological trajectories of adolescent girls. Girls who grow up with their fathers in the household experience puberty at a later age than girls who grew up in single mother households. And girls who have an unrelated man in the household, a boyfriend or stepfather, coming into the household when they're adolescents, or young adolescents, experience puberty at the earliest ages. Now, we're not entirely sure why this is the case. There are basically two theories here. One is stress. We know that when girls experience stress, they have puberty at an earlier age. Yes.
Could you speak to the microphone?
Sure, sorry. So stress can be one issue. That is, that girls whose dads are not there may have more stress in the household, and that may be the explanatory factor. Another possibility, though, is that pheromones are being communicated. And pheromones are chemicals that we emit in the course of things that send sexual signals to people in our environment. So, for instance, girls who are in a dormitory will over time get on the same cycle. They'll have their periods at the same time. That's because their pheromones are communicating to one another. And there's some work that suggests that when girls are exposed on a sustained basis in their homes to an unrelated male and his pheromones, it's basically signaling in their bodies it's time to get ready for adulthood and for a family of your own. Whereas when girls are exposed to the pheromones of their father, that's kind of sending them the message, no need to get ready for adulthood, Dad's here, you can wait on that score. So the point I'm trying to make, though, simply is that the effects of dads extend not just to these kind of psychological templates or whatever else, but they also extend actually to the very physiology of girls. And I would suspect, too, we haven't done any work on testosterone in adolescent boys, but I would love to see a study on that. In other words, how is it that the presence of the father may affect, the physiology of adolescent males? I don't know, but I have some guesses about that. So if I was to summarize the consequences, I would say that kids who are reared apart from an intact married household are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience serious negative outcomes, like we've talked about this morning. Now, I myself grew up in a single mother household. I'm not suggesting this morning that every child who experiences a non-intact family is destined for, dramatically bad outcomes. It runs about 10% for kids in intact homes and 25% for kids in non-intact households. But I want to suggest that in the aggregate, these changes are very consequential, both in neighborhoods and in society at large. So just to give you some stats, if we had the same marital stability that we have, in 1960, if we had the same level of marital stability in 1960, currently, we'd have more than 1 million fewer suspensions in our nation's schools. We'd have 1 million fewer acts of teen delinquency. We'd have fewer teen smokers and 70,000 fewer attempts at suicide. This is every year. Okay, so the collective consequences of these trends are pretty important. Now, just to conclude here, I want to end this discussion with some signs of hope. The first point that I want to make is that since the 1990s, some family trends have stabilized or improved, actually. So divorce is down modestly. Well, it's partly a class issue, in which marriage now is much more likely to be, as I said before, limited to college-educated Americans. So part of it's that the group has changed to some degree. But I think there's also been some wisdom. People have learned about the effects of divorce, particularly among college-educated Americans, and they're becoming a little bit more careful about entering into or initiating a divorce. The other trend that's positive is that marital happiness has seen a slight uptick. And this is interesting because since the 1970s, marital happiness has declined. So that's changed in recent years. And teenage sex, as you heard earlier, is down in part because of the abstinence movement. So these are some empirical indicators that I think can give us some cause for hope. Another reason for hope is that, at least on the issue of marriage, not necessarily sex, but marriage, we have seen an increasing consensus among academics and among many public policy elites that marriage matters, that marriage is important, that we should do more as a society to promote marriage, particularly for kids. Just to give you, I think, one quote that kind of illustrates this turn among elites about marriage. This is from Ron Haskins at Brookings, Sarah McClanahan, my mentor at Princeton, and Elizabeth Donahue, also at Princeton. They did a public policy brief on marriage, and they had this to say, among other things. Although it was once possible to believe that the nation's high rates of divorce, cohabitation, and non-marital childbearing represent a little more than lifestyle alternatives brought about by the freedom to pursue individual fulfillment, many analysts now believe that these individual choices can be damaging to the children who have no say in them and to the society that enables them, unquote. So the point here is that more and more honest social scientists, honest public policy leaders are seeing the value of marriage. And so I think we've made some inroads on this particular issue, and it may in turn down the pike allow us to make headway on the sexual revolution, which of course is, as I've argued today, a major factor behind the breakdown in marriage. Another point that I want to make here, to give us all, I think, some reasons for hope, because I think that can sometimes be in short supply in gatherings like this, is that there's a new openness to Catholic teaching on contraception among, not all by any means, but among a growing number of evangelicals. And you'll see this actually look a lot at evangelicals in my own research. If you look at evangelical publications, you see a lot more articles questioning contraception. Al Mohler, for instance, is the president of Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and he's a major figure in the world of Southern Baptists. And he has been raising a number of concerns about contraception in recent years. And this comes from a symposium in First Things. He said, quote, 30 years of sad experience demonstrate that Humanae Vitae correctly sounded the alarm, warning of a contraceptive mentality that would set loose immeasurable evil as modern birth control methods allowed seemingly risk-free sex outside the integrity of the marital bond. Al Mohler has kind of come to terms with the kind of evidence that I've discussed this afternoon. And as a consequence, he has changed his position. Now, he hasn't gone whole hog. He still is a little bit iffy on condoms in marriage. But he has rethought a variety of things, and I think he's still on a road that will lead him eventually to kind of a complete acceptance of in my view, the authentically Christian view on this particular question. The final point that I want to make today is that, and this goes to my point about how the sexual revolution and the retreat from marriage have hit the poor hardest. I think that faithful Christian scholars need to seize this moment and to underline the intellectual power and coherence of Christian moral teaching to Christian colleges, universities, churches, clergy, and to the public square more generally. Above all else, Christian scholars need to drive home the point that social justice cannot be divorced from sexual moral teachings. More than anyone else, the poor have been devastated by the outworkings of the sexual revolution of the last 40 years. So we must make it crystal clear that the Church's commitment to the poor requires nothing less than a vigorous proclamation of the Church's true and beautiful teaching about sex and marriage. In other words, we must make it clear that the preferential option for the poor begins in the home. Thank you.